The city is still half asleep, its stone streets washed pale by the first hint of sunrise. Church bells toll softly in the distance, their echoes mingling with the coo of pigeons perched on red-tiled roofs. Within a modest but airy studio overlooking a narrow Florentine lane, a young artist stirs from his bed. He rises slowly, the cool morning air brushing his skin, and moves to the window. Below, market stalls are being assembled, their canvas awnings unfurling like sails. The scent of fresh bread drifts upward. Somewhere a lute is being tuned, tentative notes rising like birdsong. This is his world, the world of the Renaissance, and today, like every day, he will seek to transform light and pigment into something eternal. The dawn of the studio. The first light of morning creeps over the red-tiled roofs of Florence, seeping like watered paint into the pale sky. It is not the harsh brightness of noon but a tender wash of gold, blue, and pearl. In a narrow street just off the Arno, a wooden door swells with the scent of linseed oil and chalk. Behind that door, in a studio whose walls are blotched with centuries of pigment, a man stirs before the city itself has fully awakened. He is not yet dressed for the day's audiences with patrons or guild officials, he is still only an artist, bare-armed, in a worn linen shirt, hair tied back with a strip of cloth speckled with vermilion. He lights a taper and moves across the workshop, the floor creaking beneath him. Dust from marble chips and ground stone powders his slippers. The smell of oak gesso and drying canvas hangs in the cool air. On the workbench lie mortar and pestle, mussel shells for small batches of paint, sketches pinned to boards with wooden pegs, a Madonna's hand turning just so, the curve of a saint's robe, the faint smile of a merchant's daughter who will sit for a portrait next week. In this hour, before apprentices arrive and voices fill the room, the studio belongs only to the sound of his breathing and the faint clink of glass jars. He moves to the window and pushes open the shutters. Outside, Florence murmurs like a sleeper turning over in bed. Distant church bells give a single, hesitant toll. The artist draws in the cool morning air, tasting it like a draught of clarity. This is the moment he cherishes most, when pigment and idea and muscle memory feel like one thing, when he can imagine an entire composition unfolding before a single line is drawn. He crosses to the central table where the panels for today's work are stacked. One is a small predella scene for a merchant's private chapel, another, much larger, is destined for the high altar of Santa Croce. He runs a hand over the smooth surface of the poplar wood, feeling the way the grain flows under the gesso. He knows the hours it took his apprentices to plane and glue and size it, the days of sanding and priming. All of that labor is invisible to the eye of the event. Here in the studio it is as present as the heartbeat of the building. Before he picks up a brush, he kneels briefly at a little wooden stool in the corner. A stub of a candle flickers before a painted icon of St. Luke, patron of artists. He murmurs a short prayer, not for fame or patronage, but for steadiness of hand, for clarity of vision, for humility before the work. Then he rises and begins to grind pigments. The sound is low and steady, stone on stone. Malachite turns to powder under his pestle. Lapis becomes a soft, impossible blue. He mixes them with egg yolk, with oil, with patience, until the paint glows in tiny pools like captured light. As the sun lifts higher, its rays slide across the studio floor, picking out the dust motes and making them shine. He sets the first panel on its easel. The chalk lines already sketch a figure, but now he begins to model the flesh with underpainting, thin translucent layers building up like morning mist. He works in silence, brushstrokes slow and deliberate, each one a breath. In his mind, the clatter of the marketplace, the gossip of guild halls, even the demands of his patrons recede. Here there is only pigment, wood, and the unfolding of an image he half remembers from a dream. A faint knock at the door signals the arrival of his first apprentice, a boy of 14 carrying bundles of linen rags. Another arrives with a basket of fresh eggs and a small jar of oil from his family's farm. The artist nods to them, gesturing to the grinding table. Soon the workshop fills with soft sounds, the scrape of stone, the whisper of brushes being washed, the crack of an egg, the glug of oil poured into a jar. They speak little, the master has trained them to let the morning hour stay quiet. This, he tells them, is when ideas slip in like shy visitors. Through the open shutters drifts the smell of baking bread from a nearby bakery, mingling with the scent of turpentine and earth pigments. Church bells ring again, longer now, marking the first office of the day. The artist straightens his back, flexes his fingers, and steps back from the panel. The face he is painting begins to emerge, not yet complete, but alive with the promise of expression. He smiles faintly. In this hour he does not think of how the work will be judged, or how much he will be paid, or whether his name will be remembered. In this hour he is simply at work, part of a lineage of hands stretching back through centuries, each guiding color onto the surface, each seeking to give form to something unseen. As the light deepens, he moves to another project, sketches for a ceiling fresco commissioned by a wealthy banker. He unfurls a long sheet of paper, charcoal at the ready, and begins to block out figures in flight, robes swirling, gestures reaching. He works standing, arm extended, so that his whole body moves with the line. Apprentices watch, silent, seeing how the figures seem to lift off the page. Outside, the city is waking, but inside, time slows. The studio becomes a world unto itself, where pigment and prayer, craft and vision, are all one. And so the morning stretches on, grinding, drawing, laying in color, pausing to look, to adjust, to breathe. The artist feels the rhythm of his own pulse in the brush, the weight of history in the curve of a line. The day's business with patrons will come later, as will the bustle of apprentices and the negotiation of payments. But now, in the dawn of the studio, before the clamor of Florence fully rises, the work is pure. Each stroke is a quiet affirmation of his place in this city, this time, this continuum of makers who turn raw earth into light. The circle of apprentices. By mid-morning the sun had begun to lean through the high windows, throwing angled shafts of light across the studio floor. Dust motes drift like slow snow, catching in the beams. The master painter steps back from his panel, wiping his brush on a scrap of linen. Outside, the bells of San Lorenzo sound the hour. Inside, another kind of bell has already rung, the unspoken signal that this is now the apprentices' time. They arrive in twos and threes, boys mostly, a few young men, their sandals scuffing the worn stone threshold. They smell of the streets baking bread, damp clay, the faint tang of iron from the smithy they've passed. Each carries something, a sack of fresh charcoal, a bundle of oak dowels, a little jar of rabbit-skin glue cooling from the morning's boiling. They bow their heads slightly as they enter. There is no grand ceremony, but each knows that crossing this threshold means stepping into a discipline older than any of them. The master nods, wordless, and gestures toward the long wooden tables that run the length of the workshop. There the apprentices begin their ritual tasks, grinding pigment, sanding panels, sewing small squares of linen. A boy of 15 kneels at the mortar, his hands already stained green from malachite. Another leans over a block of wood, planing its surface until it gleams like ivory. In a corner, two older apprentices stretch canvas over a frame, their movements mirrored, like a dance learned by heart. The studio fills with a soft music of labor, stone on stone, brush against cloth, the low hiss of glue being poured, the squeak of stretched linen tightening on its frame. Occasionally someone murmurs a question, or the master offers a correction, not so much oil, the pigment will separate, or hold the panel flat, feel the grain. His voice is calm, even when he chides. The apprentices have learned to listen to the rhythm of his speech the way a musician listens for the beat. On the wall hang copies of famous works, drawings of hands and drapery, anatomical studies sketched from cadavers. The apprentices glance at them as they work, absorbing proportion and line as naturally as breathing. They know that before they ever lay a brush to a client's panel, they must master the hidden architecture, the recipes for grounds and glues, the exact pressure of a sanding block, the delicate ratio of pigment to binder. This is not drudgery but apprenticeship, each motion will echo later in the freedom of their own hands. The master walks among them, a silent current moving through the room. He pauses at the pigment table, dipping a fingertip into a pile of ground lapis and smearing it across his thumb. "Good," he says simply, and the boy grinding beams as if blessed. At another table he lifts a panel, running his hand over its surface, eyes half closed. Again, he murmurs. The apprentice bows his head and begins sanding anew. The master moves on, the apprentices following his wake like small boats turning after a larger one. Light shifts. The smell of pigment grows richer as more colors are ground: ochre, cinnabar, azurite. The apprentices' sleeves are speckled like birds' eggs. One hums softly to himself, a tune from his village. Another traces the line of a saint's face in charcoal, practicing on a scrap of parchment while waiting for glue to cool. They are not yet artists, but they are no longer merely boys. The studio is their school, their home, their proving ground. In its quiet discipline they are learning not just a craft but a way of seeing. Occasionally the master calls one of them over to stand beside his easel. He explains a passage of underpainting, shows how the brush's pressure can model flesh, how a glaze can make a robe luminous. He does not give long speeches. He demonstrates, then hands the brush to the apprentice. The boy's hand trembles as he mimics the motion. The master corrects gently, guiding the wrist. When the stroke is finally right, he nods and takes the brush back. "Again tomorrow," he says. The apprentice returns to his table, eyes shining. In a corner stands a tall cabinet with drawers labeled in a careful hand: red earth, bone black, gold leaf, shell gold. Only the master opens the deeper drawers, but the apprentices sometimes catch a glimpse of their treasures: thin sheets of hammered gold like sunlight caught in paper, tiny lumps of ultramarine as dear as precious stones. These glimpses are like promises. One day, if they persevere, these colors will flow through their own fingers. As noon approaches, the workshop hums like a hive. The apprentices work in rhythm, each motion feeding the next. The master sketches on a large sheet pinned to the wall, planning a fresco for a guild hall. Now and then he asks for a color, and an apprentice hurries to bring it, brushing at the ready. The room smells of sweat and oil and the faint sweetness of egg tempera. Outside, the city grows. When the bells toll again, signaling the hour of the midday meal, the apprentices set down their tools. Some roll their shoulders, others flex stained fingers. The master steps back from his drawing and surveys the room. Panels gleam, pigments are ground to powder finer than dust, sketches litter the tables like a flock of doves. The morning's labor has laid the groundwork for the afternoon's creation. For a moment, before they disperse to eat, the master allows the silence to deepen. He looks at each of them, the boy with malachite on his hands, the youth with charcoal smudges on his cheek, and remembers himself at their age, kneeling at a mortar in a master's workshop, dreaming of commissions he could hardly imagine. He nods once, a small gesture of approval, and the apprentices bow their heads. The circle holds. They will return after the meal to continue their tasks. The pigments will be richer, the panels smoother, their own hands surer. Step by step, day by day, the craft is being passed on, as it has been for generations, from master to apprentice, from one circle of hands to another, like the turning of a wheel. Patrons and promises. The bells of the Duomo roll like thunder over the rooftops, echoing down narrow streets lined with stone. By the time their sound reaches the workshop, the apprentices have returned from their simple meal of bread and olives, and the master painter has exchanged his work smock for a darker, cleaner tunic. Afternoon in Florence is the time of business, of visits, of patrons. The great door of the studio swings open and a draft of city air enters, warm, scented faintly of leather, wine, and horses. Into this cool half-light step the patrons. They come in pairs or alone, cloaks thrown back, rings glinting in the sun. Some are merchants, their wealth built on wool or spice. Some are members of noble families with a taste for piety and display. All carry the same look. Curiosity mixed with calculation. They have heard of this painter's skill, his altarpieces, and his frescoes, and now they have come to see what he might make for them. The apprentices straighten at their tables. Brushes are laid down, rags tucked away. The master walks forward with measured steps, greeting each visitor with a bow. There is a ritual to this too. The patron praises a recent work. The master replies modestly. A sketchbook is opened, drawings spread out like playing cards. Between them, over parchment and pigment, a commission takes shape, a panel for a chapel, a portrait of a wife, a banner for a guild procession. While the masters speak softly with the patrons, the apprentices listen, absorbing more than they realize. They hear how price is discussed, how deadlines are negotiated, how one hints at divine inspiration without promising the impossible. Can see the delicacy of line. They notice how he listens to the way a donor describes a saint's expression, then translates those words into marks on a page. Sometimes the master invites a patron deeper into the workshop. He shows a panel half-finished, a fresco cartoon pinned to the wall, a small devotional piece drying in a rack. The patron runs a hand over the wood, eyes the colors. In these moments the apprentices glimpse another layer of the art, not just pigment and line, but persuasion, diplomacy, the weaving of trust. Without the patrons, no fresco rises, no panel is gilded. Without the artist, the patron's desire remains only an idea. Together they form an unwritten contract, beauty for honor, labor for legacy. In a corner of the studio stands a table reserved for presentation pieces, small panels painted with care, miniature Madonnas, studies of hands. The apprentices polish these until they gleam like jewels. When a patron hesitates, the master lifts one from the table and offers it as a token. Imagine this, but larger, your family kneeling at the feet of the Virgin, your crest in the corner. The patron's eyes brighten. A purse opens. The apprentices see and learn. As the afternoon wears on, sunlight shifts, catching on gilded halos and the curls of parchment. Deals are struck, dates set. Sometimes a patron leaves a deposit, a pouch of Florence heavy enough to dent the wood. The apprentices glance at it with furtive hope. They know that gold means work, and work means learning. Commissions feed the studio, and the studio feeds their craft. When the patrons depart, cloaks swinging, the room exhales. The master stands for a moment at the door, watching them disappear into the street. Then he turns back, a different light in his eyes. "We begin tomorrow," he says simply, and the apprentices nod. They know what that means. New panels to stretch, new pigments to grind, new designs to transfer from cartoon to wall. But before the new labor, there is a quieter moment. The master returns to his bench, unrolls a drawing, and studies it in the fading light. It is a sketch of a figure he will paint, a saint, perhaps, or a donor's lost child, or a memory of his own youth. Around him the apprentices tidy the workshop, sweeping pigment dust into little piles, stacking brushes to soak overnight. Outside, the street fills with merchants closing their shops, children calling to each other in the dusk. The master looks up at his apprentices and smiles faintly. "One day," he says, "you will meet your own patrons. Learn to listen. Learn to see what they cannot yet see." Then he rolls up the drawing and lays it aside. Evening is approaching. The patrons are gone, but the promises, soft glow of the workshop, amid the scent of pigment and wood, the art of negotiation has become another kind of apprenticeship. Tomorrow the work will begin. Tonight they have glimpsed the other side of the craft, the weaving of art and life, of vision and commission, of patrons and promises. The guild and the city. Before the sun is fully risen the sound of hammers echoes across the Arno. Florence wakes early. Bakers slide loaves into stone ovens, dyers haul vats of indigo and madder into the light, masons shoulder their tools. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the painter's apprentices hurry to keep pace with their master as he makes his way toward the heart of the city. Today is not a day for pigments or panels. Today is for the guild. The guild hall stands near the Mercato Vecchio, its facade carved with saints and emblems of trade. Behind its heavy doors the city's craft is regulated, protected, and ranked. Every painter of reputation belongs to it, and every apprentice must pass through its doors to become a master. It is here that contracts are approved, standards set, disputes settled, and, perhaps most importantly, reputations forged. The master wears his best cloak. In his hand he carries a small folio of drawings, under his arm, a panel wrapped in cloth. His apprentices carry nothing but themselves, eyes wide as they step into the hall for the first time. Inside, the noise is a low thunder of voices, the smell a mixture of ink, wax, and damp stone. On the walls hang the emblems of the guild's patron saints, in niches stand statues donated by older masters. Light filters down from high windows, striking flecks of gold leaf and glinting off silver clasps. At one end of the hall a long table is set. Behind it sit the elders of the guild, men who have painted chapels and palaces, men whose names the apprentices whisper like incantations. They nod to the master as he approaches, their expressions grave but not unfriendly. Formalities are exchanged, greetings, the mention of recent works, condolences for a fellow craftsman's illness. Then business begins. The master lays his drawings on the table. They are designs for a new altarpiece commissioned by a minor church across the river. The elders lean forward, murmuring, tracing the outlines with their fingers. Questions follow about dimensions, about pigments, about whether the gold leaf meets the guild standard. The master answers calmly. He knows the rules, knows how to bend without breaking them. When one elder raises a doubt about the number of apprentices on the project, the master replies with a quiet confidence, "They will meet the deadline. I'll give you my word." For the apprentices this is a lesson more vivid than any in the studio. They see their craft not as a private art but as part of tradition. They learn that to be a painter in Florence is also to be a citizen, a member of a brotherhood that stretches back generations. It is the guild that allows them to buy certain pigments, to bid for certain commissions, to defend their work if challenged. Without it they are only artisans, with it they are recognized as contributors to the city's beauty. Once the drawings are approved, the master unwraps the small panel he has brought, a Madonna no larger than a book. It is a sample, painted with a delicacy meant to impress. The elders study it in silence. One reaches out and touches the gold halo, another tilts it toward the light. At last they nod. The seal of the guild is pressed onto the contract, the master bows, the apprentices breathe again. Another commission secured, another step in the life of the workshop. But the guild is more than contracts. In a smaller chamber off the main hall, painters gather to exchange news. Who is working on what, which church needs a new fresco, which patron has defaulted on his payment. They speak of new techniques, oil painting whispered about from the north, new ways of preparing gesso, rumors of perspective tricks learned from mathematicians. The apprentices linger at the edges, absorbing every word. In the guild hall art becomes not just a solitary pursuit but a collective conversation, a current flowing through the city's veins. When the meeting ends the master leads his apprentices back into the streets. Florence stretches around them like a living mural, domes and towers rising into the blue, bridges arched over green water, markets thick with cloth and spice. The apprentices see it with new eyes. Every facade, every statue, every painted tabernacle by the roadside was touched by hands like theirs, approved by the same guild, commissioned under similar contracts. The city itself is their extended studio. As they walk back, the master slows his pace. Remember what you saw, he tells them. A painter does not work alone. He stands in a lineage. The guild binds us, the city feeds us, and our work, in turn, feeds the city. The apprentices nod, their heads full of carved saints and wax seals, of whispered rumors about new commissions. They are beginning to understand that art in Florence is not just an act of creation but of belonging. Back at the workshop the light has shifted, angling in through the high windows. Brushes wait in water, panels wait on racks. The apprentices shed their cloaks, roll up their sleeves, and return to their tasks with a new sense of purpose. Outside, the bells of the city toll again, counting the hours. Inside, the rhythm of the guild and the city beats in time with the rhythm of pigment and brush. In this way the master and his students live not just in a studio but in a tapestry woven of stone, law, and tradition. Tradition. They learn that to be a painter in Florence is also to be a citizen, a member of a brotherhood that stretches back generations. It is the guild that allows them to buy certain pigments, to bid for certain commissions, to defend their work if challenged. Without it they are only artisans, with it they are recognized as contributors to the city's beauty. Once the drawings are approved, the master unwraps the small panel he has brought, a Madonna no larger than a book. It is a sample, painted with a delicacy meant to impress. The elders study it in silence. One reaches out and touches the gold halo, another tilts it toward the light. At last they nod. The seal of the guild is pressed onto the contract, the master bows, the apprentices breathe again. Another commission secured, another step in the life of the workshop. But the guild is more than contracts. In a smaller chamber off the main hall, painters gather to exchange news. Who is working on what, which church needs a new fresco, which patron has defaulted on his payment. They speak of new techniques, oil painting whispered about from the north, new ways of preparing gesso, rumors of perspective tricks learned from mathematicians. The apprentices linger at the edges, absorbing every word. In the guild hall art becomes not just a solitary pursuit but a collective conversation, a current flowing through the city's veins. When the meeting ends the master leads his apprentices back into the streets. Florence stretches around them like a living mural, domes and towers rising into the blue, bridges arched over green water, markets thick with cloth and spice. The apprentices see it with new eyes. Every facade, every statue, every painted tabernacle by the roadside was touched by hands like theirs, approved by the same guild, commissioned under similar contracts. The city itself is their extended studio. As they walk back, the master slows his pace. Remember what you saw, he tells them. A painter does not work alone. He stands in a lineage. The guild binds us, the city feeds us, and our work, in turn, feeds the city. The apprentices nod, their heads full of carved saints and wax seals, of whispered rumors about new commissions. They are beginning to understand that art in Florence is not just an act of creation but of belonging. Back at the workshop the light has shifted, angling in through the high windows. Brushes wait in water, panels wait on racks. The apprentices shed their cloaks, roll up their sleeves, and return to their tasks with a new sense of purpose. Outside, the bells of the city toll again, counting the hours. Inside, the rhythm of the guild and the city beats in time with the rhythm of pigment and brush. In this way the master and his students live not just in a studio but in a tapestry woven of stone, law, and tradition. Breathe. Passers-by peer in through the open doors, rumors spread in the marketplace about what is taking shape on the cloister wall. In a city like Florence, every brushstroke is also a public act. As the day of unveiling approaches, the pace quickens. Gold leaf is pressed onto halos and banners, final glazes deepen the shadows, brighten the robes. The apprentices work silently now, aware of the clock, aware of the master's steady concentration. At night, when they step out into the street, they smell the wax and flowers already laid out for the festival. Bells ring, trumpets echo off the stone. Then comes the morning of the feast. The city gathers. Confraternities in colored robes march through the streets, merchants pause at their stalls, noblewomen lean from balconies to watch. Incense rises, the bishop blesses the crowd. And at the appointed hour, the cloth covering the new painting is drawn away. A murmur passes through the assembly. The fresco glows in the sunlight, life-size, gestures flowing like a dance, colors deep as jewels. For a moment even the chatter of the crowd stills. The master bows his head, his apprentices look up at their work, seeing it now not as labor but as vision. This is why they paint, to speak to the city, to become part of its memory. In the days that follow, the fresco becomes a landmark. Children point to it as they pass, pilgrims copy its saints into their prayer books, poets mention it in verses. The master returns to his studio with new commissions waiting on the table. Success breeds success, and public art is the surest path to lasting name. Yet he knows it is more than reputation. Public commissions and festivals bind artists and the city together. His work will outlive the feast, outlast the banners and flowers, perhaps even outlast the stones of the cloister itself. It is a form of civic prayer, a gift to the community as much as to God. In return the city feeds him, shelters him, and gives his apprentices a future. Back in the studio, the apprentices resume their practice on small panels. The master watches them for a moment before taking up his own brush again. Outside, Florence is already preparing for the next festival. Inside, colors are ground, gesso smoothed, sketches begun. The cycle of public art and public celebration will continue as long as the city's bells ring. Festivals, processions, and pageantry. The bells of Florence ring before dawn, not for work but for wonder. Once or twice each season the city sheds its everyday face and clothes itself in festivals. The streets that yesterday smelled of sawdust and bread now carry the scent of beef. For the artist, this is not simply spectacle. It is part of his life's rhythm. His frescoes and altarpieces will be carried in procession or unveiled at the climax of a feast. He knows that the success of a commission depends not only on the pigments he grinds in his studio but on how his work moves through the living river of people. As the morning unfolds, guilds march out behind their standard: wool workers, silk merchants, stonemasons, and goldsmiths, each with its own colors and devices. Apprentices scatter petals into the air, trumpets echo between the high walls of the narrow streets. Monks chant as they walk, children dressed as angels carry candles taller than themselves. At the head of the procession a silver reliquary glints in the sun, borne on the shoulders of men who sway with its weight. From a high window the artist leans out, sketchbook in hand. This is where he learns anatomy, drapery, movement, not in the stiff poses of the studio but in the flowing tide of real life. He marks the way a banner twists in the wind, the tilt of a child's head as she looks up at the reliquary, the stern grace of a guild master holding a staff. These images will return in his next painting, not as direct copies but as living impressions. By noon the procession reaches the piazza. A platform draped in red velvet has been erected before the cathedral. On it the city's leaders sit in a row of carved chairs, and next to them a space has been left for the unveiling of a new work, perhaps a great altarpiece, perhaps a sculpted Madonna. The artist stands just behind the curtain, heart beating faster than on any other day. He knows that this is not only art but theater, politics, and devotion combined. When the moment comes, the curtain is drawn back. Gasps rise from the crowd. Gold leaf catches the sun, figures larger than life seem to step forward. Bells ring again. Children on their parents' shoulders point and murmur. Somewhere a poet will already be composing a sonnet about this moment. The artist's apprentices exchange glances, they feel as if they too have stepped into history. Yet the festival is more than one unveiling. As dusk approaches, the city fills with music. Players in bright livery pluck lutes, masked performers enact stories from the old legends, fire eaters draw circles of light in the air. Food stalls include honey cakes, roasted chestnuts, and flasks of new wine. The artist walks among it all, his hands stained with paint but his senses open, absorbing color, scent, and sound for later use. Sometimes his own designs spill out into the festival itself. He may be asked to paint temporary triumphal arches from wood and canvas, to design the costumes of a sacred drama, to draw the floats that will carry guild banners through the streets. In such work there is no permanence. The arch will be taken down tomorrow, the costumes returned to storage, the painted float peeled and burned for fuel. But the memory will remain in thousands of minds, and in the artist's own sketches. From these sketches new commissions will arise. Late at night, when the bells mark the last procession and the piazza begins to empty, the artist walks back to his workshop. The banners droop, wax gutters in the street, the smell of incense lingers like a fading chord. In his mind he is already translating what he has seen into pigment and line, the flash of a standard, the glow of a torch on a carved column, the press of faces upturned. Festivals feed his imagination as much as they feed the city's spirit. Tomorrow the work resumes: gesso, grinding, and scaffolds. But tonight the city has shown its other face, and the artist has stood within it, part participant, part observer, part creator of its pageantry. This is the world in which a Renaissance artist lives. Not sealed in a studio but woven into the great fabric of civic ritual, where art, devotion, and spectacle become one. Evening in the piazza. The sun drifts down the tiled roofs of the city like molten copper. Shadows stretch long across the flagstones. The same piazza that only hours ago rang with trumpets and banners now exhales a slow, warm breath. Vendors begin to shutter their stalls. The smell of roasted chestnuts mingles with beeswax and the faint salt of the Arno drifting up from its banks. The artist walks out from a narrow side street, cloak over one shoulder, sketchbook tucked under his arm. He lingers on the edge of the square for a moment, letting the rhythm change. Children who paraded as angels in the morning now chase pigeons around the fountain. Apprentices, still with smudges of pigment on their hands, carry benches back to the guild hall. A lute player rests his instrument on his knee and plucks a gentle tune meant more for himself than for the crowd. Slowly the light softens. It glances off marble cornices and the gilded halos of saints on a nearby facade. Lanterns are lit one by one along the arcade. Their glow pools on the stones in irregular circles, inviting small gatherings. Here a group of merchants talks quietly about shipments from Pisa. There two nuns exchange news about a convent in Siena. In another corner, a poet recites lines he composed about the day's pageant, his voice low, more confiding than declaiming. The artist takes a seat on the steps of the fountain. He flips open his book and begins to sketch not the grand procession but the small, unguarded gestures of evening, a girl leaning on her mother's arm, a baker's boy dozing beside a basket of bread, a dog curled at the feet of a weary soldier. This is his private treasury. In the dim light, faces relax, masks fall away, and the city reveals its ordinary grace. Of supper garlic, olive oil, fresh bread and cooling stone. Someone laughs softly near the fountain, someone else murmurs a prayer. The artist, caught between noise and silence, feels a deep stillness take hold. He looks up at the tower, at the thin crescent of the moon above it. Tomorrow will bring more pigment to grind, more contracts to negotiate, more scaffolds to climb. But this hour belongs to the piazza itself, to the pause between day and night. He can feel the city's pulse slowly, can almost hear the brushstrokes of dusk painting over the bright colors of the festival with a wash of indigo and gray. When at last he closes his sketchbook, the lanterns flicker in a small breeze. A friar passes, scattering crumbs for the pigeons. Two apprentices bid him good night. He rises and walks across the square, the echo of his footsteps lost in the murmuring of fountains. Behind him the piazza settles into its nocturne stone and water, lamp and shadow ready to dream until dawn. Night reflections. The streets of Florence are hushed now, their stones cooling under the first stars. The artist's sandals whisper over cobblestones damp with evening dew. He passes shuttered workshops and sleeping hounds, the smell of charcoal and linseed oil lingering faintly from the day's work. Overhead, balconies frame slivers of moonlight, a single window glows like an ember behind carved wooden shutters. He reaches his door, pushes it open, and enters the narrow stairwell. Inside the studio, the air holds a different quiet, the heavy, fragrant stillness of pigment and gesso. Brushes are laid out like sleeping soldiers. Sketches hang from cords across the rafters, swaying slightly in the draft. A candle flickers on the workbench, casting long shadows that blend into the dark corners. He does not light more lamps. Instead he sits at the window ledge, looking down at the square he left behind. The fountain glimmers in faint moonlight. A stray cat crosses the stones, tail curling like a question mark. He closes his eyes and breathes in the scent of turpentine, wax, and baked bread from a distant bakery. The noise of the city has fallen away to a single heartbeat. This is the hour when the day's impressions settle. He turns his sketchbook slowly, page by page, lingering over faces drawn in quick strokes. In the silence, memories of the morning's apprenticeships, the guild's murmured debates, and the festival's swirl of colors return like the tide, but softened, diffused. He notices small details he missed before, the tremor in a patron's hand, the curve of a lute string, the way a child's gaze followed a banner. He picks up a piece of charcoal and, without plan, begins to trace a line on new paper. It becomes the silhouette of a tower, then a profile, then a gesture of folded hands. Around him, the darkness seems to thicken. He thinks of the masters whose frescoes he studied, of apprentices who will one day surpass him, of how each brushstroke is a moment trying to outlast time. A bell tolls midnight from the Duomo. Its vibrations run through the floorboards and his own ribs. He lays down the charcoal and simply sits, listening. In that sound he feels the entire city breathing, the stone arches, the river, the arches of bridges, the dreams of thousands sleeping under terracotta roofs. He feels himself as part of a great current, one artist among many, one life among many, all shaping and shaped by this place. When at last the echo fades, he snuffs the candle. The room falls into a soft darkness, lit only by moonlight pooling on the plaster wall. He leans back, hands loosely folded, and lets his thoughts drift like pigment in water. Tomorrow will be another canvas, another commission, another morning in the studio. But tonight belongs to silence, to reflection, to the quiet hum of a city dreaming its own masterpieces. He closes his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids colors bloom, ultramarine, vermilion, gold. They swirl like fresco fragments in a cathedral's vault. Slowly his breathing deepens, and the night gathers him into its rhythm, a living sketch of rest. Master and legacy, the artist at the height of his powers. Morning light floods the studio not as a timid visitor but as an old friend. The windows are larger now than in his youth, cut into the walls of a building he owns outright, a studio built from years of coin and reputation. Where once the smell of plaster and sweat belonged to another man's workshop, here the scents are his: warm linseed oil, cut marble, the faint sharpness of pigment ground fresh on a stone slab. Brushes hang like a regiment of banners, ready. Canvases lean against the walls like silent witnesses. In the high rafters, pigeons coo, and from the street below comes the hum of a city that knows his name. The master sits at a tall worktable, turning a silver-point drawing between his fingers. It is a study for a great altarpiece promised to a cathedral across the river, his largest commission yet, financed by bankers whose palaces gleam with imported marble. But he lingers over the sketch not with greed but with something close to reverence. Each line of graphite is both memory and prophecy. He sees the gestures of apprentices who now mirror his old hand. He sees the weight of tradition bending to his own experiments. He is, at last, a man whose style is studied as once he studied others. At the far end of the studio, apprentices move with practiced quiet. They grind pigments from chunks of lapis, crush vermilion, stretch new canvases across frames. The scrape of metal on stone is rhythmic, almost musical. He listens, remembering the years when he was the boy at the grindstone, aching to hold a brush of his own. Now, when an apprentice approaches with a question, "Maestro, should the underdrawing follow the old proportion, or your new measure?" he answers with the patient authority of one who has invented his own measure. Beyond the studio, the city itself seems an extension of his work. Arched bridges carry his statues. Frescoes of his design glow in civic halls. Even the pageants at festival time borrow his motifs. Walking through the piazza, he sees his own ideas reflected back to him in embroidery, in tapestries, in the gestures of street performers who mimic his painted saints. Fame, he realizes, is not only a matter of money or titles but of living inside a world reshaped by your own vision. Late in the morning a soft commotion rises from the stairwell. Two patrons climb the stone steps to the studio, their attendants carrying rolls of parchment and small coffers of coin. These are no longer the minor guild officers who once dictated the terms of a commission. These are men whose signet rings can open doors at court, whose names echo through banking houses in Venice and Florence. They pause at the threshold, half awed and half curious, as if stepping into a chapel rather than a workshop. The master greets them not with the deferential bow of his apprentice years but with a calm that balances courtesy and command. He knows what his labor is worth. He knows that without his eye and his hand their palaces will remain mute stone. They move among the canvases leaning against the walls, whispering to one another. A half-finished Madonna, the twist of a drapery rendered in soft lead point, the architectural framework of a great mural pinned to a board, each image arrests them differently. When they speak at last, it is in the language of contracts, deadlines, and the flow of ducats. But beneath the commerce there is something else, an unspoken hunger. These men want to stand in history, and they know his brush can place them there. The master senses it and, with a slight smile, lays out his terms: time, materials, freedom of composition. He will depict their saints, but in his own way. He will echo tradition, but bend it toward the new. As the negotiations conclude, apprentices slip between tables with trays of wine and fruit. They listen with lowered eyes, yet every word etches itself into their memory. In the years to come, they too will stand at a worktable facing patrons, their hands calloused but steady, repeating these same rituals but the web of lives into which his work will flow, mothers who will kneel before his altarpieces, children who will crane their necks at his frescoed ceilings, strangers yet unborn who will measure their own drawings against his. Behind him the apprentices resume their tasks. One stretches a new canvas, humming a tavern tune under his breath. Another carefully copies a fragment of the master's sketch, learning not only the line but the discipline of patience. The master turns back, crossing the floor with slow steps. He pauses beside the boy at the easel, the youngest, with ink stains on his fingers and, without a word, adjusts the angle of the brush in the boy's hand. A small correction, almost invisible, but it changes the whole flow of the stroke. The boy's eyes widened, he felt the difference. Again, the master murmurs, and the boy begins anew. In these moments, teaching becomes a kind of quiet prayer. Each gesture, each whispered instruction is a seed cast forward into time. He thinks of his own teacher, the old man with a crooked back who once rapped his knuckles for sloppy hatching, and feels a sudden, unexpected gratitude. Legacy is not a monument, it is a chain of hands guiding other hands. As afternoon light slants across the floor, the master retreats to a small alcove behind the main hall. Here, away from the noise of grinding pigments and muttered lessons, he keeps his private sketches, notebooks filled with anatomical studies, designs for machines, wild flights of geometry that have no patron yet. In these pages he is not a public craftsman but a private seeker, still questioning, still inventing. The city may call him maestro, but within himself he remains a student of form and light. The contradiction steadies him. It reminds him that greatness is not a fixed summit but an ongoing climb. The alcove smells of ink and old paper. Afternoon bells roll across the rooftops, a low tide of sound that reaches even this hidden corner. The master dips his pen and traces a curve on the page, a spiral he has drawn 100 times before, trying once more to perfect its balance. In the main hall the apprentices whisper and the sound of a grinding stone rises, but here there is only the faint scratch of nib on paper. For a few heartbeats he feels himself dissolve into the line, as if the world outside the notebook has faded and only this rhythm remains. He remembers how, as a boy, he had copied a fresco in a dusty chapel, sneaking back after vespers to study the faces by candlelight. That boy is still inside him, astonished at every new fold of drapery, every glimpse of anatomy beneath the skin. Fame has not dulled that astonishment. If anything it has sharpened it, made him aware that every commission is only a fragment of a larger search. A knock on the doorframe draws him back. It is his eldest apprentice, bearing a sealed letter stamped with a wax crest. The master breaks it open and scans the script. A noble family from Siena is inviting him to design a cycle of frescoes for their new chapel. Another name, another city. He sets the letter aside and looks out the window again. Beyond the narrow street the sky is turning the color of pale copper. The offer is tempting, but he feels the tug of his own workshop, his own students. To accept would mean leaving them, at least for a season. Legacy requires choice, and every choice leaves a shadow. When he returns to the main hall, the apprentices are cleaning brushes and lowering shutters. Dust motes drift in shafts of light like tiny planets. He calls them together and, instead of announcing the commission, he begins to tell a story. It is about a sculptor he met years ago, who chased every patron across Europe but never finished a single work. The lesson is plain, but he does not state it outright. He lets the story hang in the air, as pigment hangs in suspension before it settles. The apprentices nod slowly, each taking from it what he can. Evening draws on. The master walks through the city streets, cloak gathered close, hood up to deflect the attention of passers-by. Market stalls are closing, bread sellers calling their last prices, children darting between carts. In the piazza a small crowd gathers around a troupe of musicians. He stops at the edge, unnoticed, and listens. The melody loops like one of his own spirals, rising and falling, carrying a sadness beneath its brightness. For a moment he is simply another citizen, warmed by the same notes, wrapped in the same twilight. Back in the workshop, candles flare. He has invited a few friends and patrons for a quiet viewing of a nearly finished altarpiece. They stand before it, murmuring. In their reflections on the polished gold leaf he sees their longing to be moved, to be remembered, to touch something beyond their lives. This is why he paints, he thinks, not only to record a likeness but to open a door. He steps back, letting them look without explanation. When they leave and the door closes behind them, the studio falls into a hush. He takes a slow breath and walks once more to his alcove. On the table lies a fresh sheet of paper. He writes a single line at the top, not a sketch but a sentence, something he has begun doing lately. To draw is to pray with one's eyes open. He studies the words, then adds another. Outside, night deepens. Inside, the flame of the candle tilts and rights itself. He thinks of the apprentices asleep on the floor above, of their restless dreams of fame. He thinks of the paintings that will outlast him, of the walls that may crumble but leave behind a trace of color. Legacy is not certain. It is a bridge built stone by stone across darkness. He lifts his pen again and continues to write, filling the page as though it were a canvas, letting the ink move like breath. In the silence that follows, the master feels the weight of the day, not the exhaustion of labor but the fullness of a life spent shaping and being shaped. Beyond the city the hills are dark, beyond the hills, stars are rising. Tomorrow there will be another letter, another sketch, another moment of teaching. The work is never finished. He smiles, almost imperceptibly, and dips his pen once more. Patronage and power, the hidden hands behind the artist. The bells of Santa Maria Novella toll in the gray half-light before sunrise, their echo rolling over the terracotta roofs like a low tide. Down in the narrow street where the artist lives, shutters creak open one by one, apprentices hurry past carrying bread and charcoal sticks, a donkey cart creaks under the weight of marble blocks destined for a sculptor's yard. Florence is stirring again, and in its stirring lies the pulse of gold and politics as much as paint. Inside his studio, the artist who has become our companion through these chapters pauses over a panel primed for tempera. He has been awake since before dawn, grinding azurite with a pestle, straining it through fine muslin, watching the pigment settle in a small earthen bowl like a lake of trapped sky. The hush of early morning allows him a brief moment of solitude, but even here the invisible presence of his patron surrounds him. The great families of the city, Medici, Piazzas, Strozzi, extend their reach into every workshop and chapel wall. Their coins pay for pigment and apprentices, but their wishes, whispered or written, shape the content of every scene. He knows this as he dips a brush into water. The sketch before him of a virgin under an arch of laurel will one day hang in a private chapel, commissioned not only for devotion but for display. He feels the weight of that dual purpose in his wrist as he moves the brush. The virgin's eyes must be serene but not remote. The donor's sons must appear kneeling at her feet, discreet but recognizable. Even the folds of a painted cloak can speak of alliances and rivalries if a patron insists on a certain shade of blue. Outside, footsteps echo closer. His oldest apprentice appears in the doorway carrying a rolled parchment sealed with red wax. From the banker's household, the boy says, and hands it over as though it were a reliquary. The artist breaks the seal. Inside is a list of changes, some small, the angel's hair to be lighter, and some large, replace St. Florence with St. Sebastian, our family's protector. He exhales slowly. Patronage is a dance, and each step must be measured if one is to keep the floor beneath one's feet. Yet there is opportunity hidden within constraint. The artist remembers his first major commission, a fresco for a guild hall, and how the merchant who paid for it also arranged for his introduction to scholars, architects, and even a visiting astronomer from Padua. That single patron's interest in the stars had led to the artist's study of perspective, the tracing of invisible lines from vanishing point to vanishing point until walls seemed to dissolve into infinite space. The artist had realized then that money may dictate the subject, but curiosity can still guide execution. In the interstices between a patron's demand and an artist's brush lies a narrow, fertile freedom. Now, as the studio brightens with morning light, the apprentices begin their tasks. One mixes vermilion, another sketches out the borders of a tapestry design. The smell of egg yolk and gesso mingles with the tang of burning olive oil in the lamps. The artist moves among them like a quiet conductor, correcting a line here, adjusting a proportion there. He carries the new parchment in his hand, but he does not yet speak of its contents. There will be time for negotiation later, when the patron himself arrives. In a city like Florence, power is not abstract. It walks in human form up the studio steps, cloaked in velvet, its fingers heavy with rings. The artist has seen how a patron's glance can ruin a rival or elevate an unknown apprentice to master overnight. He has seen commissions used to reward loyalty or to signal subtle defiance of the ruling faction. He has painted altarpieces that were as much political banners as devotional objects. Every brushstroke carries a second meaning. And yet, amid this intricate web of expectation and influence, the artist feels something like pride. To be entrusted with these images that will outlast donors and regimes alike is to hold a quiet power of one's own. Patrons may dictate who appears in the foreground, but it is the artist who decides how light falls, what gestures mean, how the eye moves across the surface. A family's name may be carved into a frame, but the painter's invisible hand guides generations yet unborn to see the world a certain way. The morning stretches on. Outside, the street fills with the rumble of carts and the call of vendors. Inside, the studio hums with muted industry. The artist, standing at his easel, begins to speak softly to his apprentices about proportion and anatomy. He speaks of how a figure must feel grounded even when it floats on a cloud, of how drapery can suggest wind or stillness, of how the secret of great art is balance between what is seen and what is implied. The apprentices listen, their hands never pausing in their tasks, each secretly hoping that one day a patron will enter and see not just their master but them. In the corner of the studio hangs a tapestry half finished, its design a procession of saints and civic figures. The artist glances at it and imagines the festival day when it will be unfurled from a balcony, colors blazing in sunlight, the crowd below murmuring. He knows the banker who ordered it hopes to link his family's piety with the city's pride. He also knows that, in a subtle flourish of pattern hidden near the base, he has woven a symbol of his own workshop, a tiny small enough to escape notice but large enough to remind the initiated that art is not only service but self. As the sun lifts higher, a shadow falls across the threshold. The patron himself has arrived, his retinue of clerks behind him. Velvet sweeps the floor, a gold chain glints at his throat. He enters without knocking, as though the studio were another room in his palazzo. The apprentices bow their heads slightly. The artist turns, brushes his hand, and greets him with a measured smile. Here begins another chapter in the endless negotiation between vision and power, a negotiation that will shape not only the work on the easel but the very course of the artist's life. The patron crosses the threshold with the faintest scent of incense and leather clinging to his cloak. Behind him two clerks shuffle in, each carrying folios tied with silk ribbons. They set them down on the long worktable near the window where the light is best. One folio contains the contracts, the dry bones of patronage, and the other the sketches he himself had approved months ago. In his hands he carries a rosary of dark wood, the beads click softly as he walks, a sound as steady as a metronome. "Maestro," he says, and extends his hand. The artist wipes his fingers on a cloth before taking it. Their palms touch briefly, callous against ringed softness. A dozen apprentices glance up and then quickly back at their work. They speak first of courtesy, the health of the banker's wife, the progress of the new chapel under construction, the rumor of a new shipment of ultramarine from the east. Only then do they approach the subject of changes. The patron, seated now on a carved oak chair brought for him, draws out the parchment with his own annotations. He speaks of Saint Sebastian, of the need for a certain dignity in the angel's expression, of his cousin's upcoming wedding for which he hopes the panel will be ready. His tone is measured but expectant. Money has been advanced, reputation is at stake. The artist listens carefully, his brush poised above the water jar. He does not argue yet. Instead, he asks questions that sound like compliance but are in fact strategy. Would your lordship prefer the saint clothed in Roman garb or more modestly? Might the angel's gaze incline toward the donor's sons? Each question draws out more of the patron's intention until the underlying motives stand revealed. Only when he understands them does he begin to suggest subtle shifts that preserve his composition while satisfying the donor's pride. This is the unseen theater of the Renaissance studio. Pigment and plaster may fill the air, but equally potent are negotiation, tact, and the artist's ability to read the human soul. Every brushstroke has an echo in diplomacy. Every change in hue signals a compromise won or lost. In the space between the easel and the paper, as the conversation unfolds, the apprentices continue their work but their ears prick at every word. They know that these moments can determine the future of the whole workshop. A satisfied patron can double commissions, provide introductions, even send a gifted apprentice to Rome. An offended one can withdraw support overnight. The stakes are painted not only on the panel but on the walls of the studio itself. Finally, the patron rises. He glances at the unfinished panel, at the shimmering blue that even now seems to catch and hold the morning light. "Yes," he says slowly, "I believe this will please my household." He clasps the artist's shoulder, a gesture of both blessing and possession, and departs with his clerks, leaving behind the faint rustle of silks and the smell of incense. The door closes. Only then does the artist exhale. Around him the studio resumes its natural rhythm, like a flock settling after a hawk has passed overhead. He unrolls his own full-scale drawing, traces a finger over the grid of perspective lines, and begins to adjust the composition. The apprentices crowd closer, eager to see how the master will weave the patron's wishes into his own design. He explains as he works not merely what he is doing but why. Notice how the angel's arm leads the eye toward the Virgin. Notice how this line, he draws it lightly with charcoal, will guide the viewer back to the donor's sons without breaking the harmony. Always remember, apprentices, that the viewer's gaze is a river. You must build its banks carefully so it flows where you want. Outside, the city bell tolls the hour of terce. Sunlight slants through the high windows, striking flecks of gold leaf so that the air seems full of dust and stars. A boy stirs a pot of rabbit-skin glue on the brazier, another crushes malachite into powder. Somewhere in the street below, a lute plays a snatch of song. Life, commerce, and art mingle inseparably. Later in the day, when the apprentices disperse for their meal, the artist remains at his easel. He is alone now, the studio echoing faintly. He thinks about how many invisible hands guide his own, not only patrons and donors, but guild statutes, civic pride, even the shape of theology itself. He recalls a sermon he once heard about the artist as an instrument of divine will. Perhaps that is true. Yet he also knows that pigment under his fingers has its own stubborn life, that color and form sometimes lead him where no contract ever specified. In that moment of solitude, he allows himself a rare smile. Power may fund the work, but the vision is his. When the banker's grandchildren kneel beneath this panel decades from now, they will see their family saint and their family likeness, but they will also see a world structured by the artist's geometry, lit by his imagined sun. Patronage. Evening begins to seep into the studio. The apprentices return carrying bread and wine, laughing at some joke from the street. The artist sets aside his brush and joins them, not as a master but as a man sharing a simple meal. He breaks bread, dips it into oil, listens to their chatter. Outside, the bells of Vespers toll. Tomorrow another patron may come, another contract may be signed, another negotiation may begin. But for now, in the fading light, there is only the quiet satisfaction of a day's work done under the gaze of invisible powers and the knowledge that, between those powers and his hand, something enduring has been born. After the simple supper the apprentices drift back to their benches, wiping crumbs from their tunics, dipping brushes again into pigment. The master stays seated for a while, cup in hand, and watches them with a quiet, measuring eye. This is his second studio within the studio, the social one. He has learned over the years that skill alone does not hold a workshop together, a sense of belonging does. Patronage pays the rent and buys the pigment, but loyalty and training shape the hands that will one day carry his name into the future. He rises, stretches, and gestures for one of the older apprentices to bring forward the chest of drawings. Out come cartoons of saints and mythic scenes, but also sketches for civic banners, festival floats, wedding emblems, funeral effigies, the unending stream of commissions that sustain the workshop. He lays them out across the table, one by one, explaining the origins of each. This banner ordered by the Guild of Merchants, that portrait commissioned as a dowry gift, this triumphal arch to be built of timber for the entry of a foreign prince. Each drawing is a window into a web of obligations and ambitions. You see, he tells them, tracing a finger across a design of intertwined dolphins and lilies, each patron imagines himself at the center of a world. Our task is to build that world around him while quietly bending it toward our own sense of order. It is like composing a piece of music. His theme may be loud and clumsy, but we can weave harmonies that make it beautiful. As he speaks, the street below begins to thrum with evening commerce. Donkey carts clatter over cobblestones, women call out the price of herbs and onions, a troupe of actors rehearses a scene for an upcoming mystery play. The sounds drift upward through the windows and mingle with the scratch of quills and the faint hiss of charcoal on paper. The artist senses how porous the walls really are. Although his studio seems a world apart, it is constantly fed by the city's pulse, by its markets, its gossip, its patrons, its clergy, its power struggles. Even the colors on his palette have traveled here on trade routes stretching from Afghanistan to Venice. One apprentice asks a question in a hesitant voice, "Master, how do you know when to obey and when to resist?" The artist pauses. He dips his brush into water, watching the pigment swirl like a cloud. "It is like steering a boat," he says at last. "The river belongs to no man, yet if you read its currents you can move where you wish. Sometimes you let yourself be carried, sometimes you push against the stream. The trick is never to forget your destination. He shows them a panel he painted years ago under the eye of a domineering bishop. He demanded a golden halo 3 times larger than any saint had worn before, he says with a wry smile. I gave it to him, but I painted into the halo a ring of tiny stars, each representing the virtues he lacked. He never noticed. The people did. Laughter ripples through the room, then dies down as the apprentices sense the lesson beneath the joke. Night deepens. Candles are lit, their flames reflected in the polished copper pots where glues and oils simmer. Shadows lengthen across the fresco cartoon tacked to the wall. The master sets aside his teaching and returns to his own work. He stands before the panel destined for the banker's private chapel, and for a long time does nothing but look. Patronage has set the theme, but the composition is his. Slowly, deliberately, he begins to layer glazes over the angel's wing, building a radiance that will seem to emanate from within. The apprentices watch in silence. In these moments they see what no contract can compel, the act of making light out of pigment, of turning obligation into vision. From time to time the master murmurs a note to himself, a measurement, a shift in hue, a reminder to check the guild statute about the use of certain pigments. Even here the invisible hand of power reaches in. The guild controls not only who may call himself a painter but which materials may be used, at what price, under what oath of secrecy. The master has sat in those meetings, has seen fines levied, apprentices censured. He knows the guild protects as much as it restricts. Without it there would be no standards, no communal bargaining, no shared workshops. With it, there is also hierarchy, jealousy, and the slow grind of politics. The candles burn lower. In the distance the bells of Compline begin to toll from a monastery across the river. The sound drifts through the window like a benediction. The apprentices clean their brushes, cover the pots, and lay damp cloths over the panels. The master straightens his back and steps away from the easel. He feels the ache of a day's negotiations in his shoulders, but also the quiet glow of progress made. Before they leave, he calls them together. Remember this, he says, his voice low but steady. Patronage is power, but so is craft. They nod, each one seeing in his mind's eye some future fresco, some altar, some civic banner bearing his own touch. For a moment the studio feels like a chapel itself, lit by candles, filled with the scent of glue and pigment, its congregation bound not by creed but by art. Then the spell breaks. They file out into the night, their chatter fading down the stairs. The master lingers a moment longer, looking out over the rooftops of the city. Torches flicker along the river, a distant square erupts in music from a festival rehearsal, the cathedral dome rises against a sky full of stars. He thinks of the patrons who sleep behind heavy doors tonight, dreaming of immortality purchased with florins. He thinks of the unseen weavers and miners and traders whose labor brought the colors to his palette. He thinks of his own hands, stained and steady. When he finally extinguishes the candles and closes the door, the studio falls into darkness. Yet in his mind the composition glows on, lines and colors moving like constellations. Tomorrow there will be more patrons, more contracts, more compromises. But tonight there is a moment of clarity, the sense that beneath all the hidden hands and whispered demands, art still moves with its own pulse, and that pulse will carry him and them far beyond the reach of any banker's will. Fame, memory, and the artist's shadow. The bells of the city toll again before dawn, but this time the sound seems different. It echoes up through the stone streets, past the shuttered windows and the frescoed chapels, until it reaches the studio where the master sits alone. The apprentices are still asleep, the patrons not yet stirring, but he is awake, staring at a sheet of parchment on which a letter lies open. It is from a court far away, bearing a wax seal of a prince he has never met. He has been summoned to paint a series of murals glorifying the dynasty's ancestors. The commission will make his name echo through Europe, but the price will be months, perhaps years away from his city, his workshop, his apprentices. The letter trembles slightly in his hand. Outside, the first merchants of the morning set up their stalls, their calls drift faintly into the room. He imagines their faces years from now, when they speak of him, the artist who left, the artist who grew famous, the artist who perhaps never returned. Fame has its own tide, and it can sweep a man farther than he means to go. He rises and moves about the studio, touching each object as if to anchor himself. The familiar smell of ground pigments, the worn edge of the bench where an apprentice sits, the stack of cartoons ready for transfer to plaster, the unfinished panel glowing faintly in the candlelight. This place has been his world. Yet beyond its walls is another world, a world of courts, of palaces, of princes who dream of their likenesses painted larger than life. He remembers the first time he saw his own teacher pack up his brushes and travel to another city. He had stood at the door, a boy holding a rag, watching the master disappear into a carriage. "Your work will carry you farther than your feet ever will," the man had said. Now those words return like a tide. The apprentices arrive one by one, rubbing sleep from their eyes. They sense the mood, the studio feels like a chapel before a funeral. When he finally tells them about the letter, their faces flicker with conflicting emotions: pride, excitement, fear. Some see opportunity, some see abandonment. He explains the terms as gently as he can: some will accompany him, some will remain here under a trusted journeyman. The workshop's name will continue, but its heart will move. While they work, he begins to sketch for them the designs he imagines for the prince's murals. He draws towering figures of knights and saints, interwoven with scenes of harvest and music, battles and coronations. He wants them to understand that even a court commission can contain the truth that within the framework of power and self-promotion there is space for honest vision. "We can tell their story," he murmurs, "but we can also tell the story of the people who built their kingdom." As the day wears on, patrons arrive, their footsteps echoing in the stairwell. Some come to hurry existing commissions, others to hint at new ones. Word has already spread of the letter. They speak to him differently now, more deferentially, as if he is already a man of two cities. Fame changes not only the artist but the air around him. That evening, he walks alone to the piazza. The market has emptied, only stray cats move among the wooden stalls. The cathedral looms above, its facade catching the last light. He sits on a stone bench and watches the sky darken. For the first time in years he feels himself at the threshold of something vast and uncertain. Behind him lies the workshop, the apprentices, the smell of pigment and glue. Before him lies a court he has never seen, a promise written in another man's hand. He closes his eyes and listens to the city. Bells ring again in the distance, a woman sings as she carries water, a child laughs somewhere in an upper window. These sounds, he thinks, are the true patrons of art, the lives that flicker and pass while the fresco endures. Whether he stays or goes, this is what he will paint: the breath of a city, the hands of workers, the turning of seasons, the heartbeat beneath the marble. Back in the studio, by candlelight, he begins a final panel to leave behind. It is not a commission, no one has paid for it. It is a portrait of the workshop itself, apprentices at their tasks, brushes poised, faces intent. At the center he places an empty stool. He paints it with such care that it seems to glow. Someday another master will sit there. When he lays down his brush, the sky outside is a deep indigo. Stars tremble above the rooftops. Tomorrow he will answer the letter. Tonight he feels both heavy and light, like a man standing between two tides. The studio is silent but not empty. In the quiet he can almost hear the voices of future apprentices, future patrons, future critics, a murmur that stretches forward like a road. He breathes in, long and slow. Fame may take him away, but this room, this city, this moment will follow him. And in his paintings, in the faces of angels, in the folds of drapery, in the arches of backgrounds, he will hide fragments of it all: the scent of pigment, the sound of apprentices laughing, the bells of the piazza at dusk. This is the artist's shadow, and it will travel farther than his body ever will. Patrons become myths, paintings become stories. Morning mist clings to the stone arcades as the artist returns from the princely court to the city where he began. His beard is flecked with grey now, his apprentices are journeymen running their own studios. In the piazza, hawkers are not only selling fruit and bread but woodcut prints of his altarpieces and tapestries inspired by his designs. Children play at being painters, smudging chalk onto the stones. He realizes with a start that his work is no longer only his, it has become a story, traded and transformed like a folk tale. At the guild hall, a scribe reads aloud to an audience of merchants and priests of Vita, a biography of the great master from their city. The words exaggerate his origins, embroider his hardships, and polish his virtues until he sounds like a saint. Each sentence elicits murmurs and applause. When the artist steps through the door, heads turn, but many do not recognize him at first. The man in the story is larger than life, while he is simply tired and travel-worn. This is how the chapter opens. With the artist walking through a city where his name is now a legend, and the gap between legend and life yawns wide. He passes frescoes he painted decades ago and sees offerings of candles at their base, as if they were relics. He overhears sailors from far-off ports telling each other about the miracle worker with the brush, each adding their own embellishment. He watches apprentices copy his drawings not as exercises but as talismans. The air feels charged with echoes. The narrative then follows him through a day of encounters. He visits a convent whose cloisters he decorated in his youth. The nuns recount to him a miracle associated with one of his panels, a sick child allegedly cured after praying before the Virgin he painted. He stops at a print shop where sheets of his designs are being sold alongside devotional images. He speaks with the printer about how the blocks have been recut, images altered, signatures erased. He meets an old apprentice who is now a master in another city. They sit at a tavern table, drinking wine, reminiscing, and debating whether the myths surrounding art serve or harm the truth of it. In the evening, a civic procession winds through the streets, musicians, banners, torches. The city is celebrating its founding, and one of the floats carries an enormous painted panel, a reproduction of his work, but gaudier, brighter, simplified for the crowd. The artist watches the torches flicker against its surface and feels both pride and estrangement. The painting is alive in a way he did not intend. The chapter closes with him returning to his studio, now smaller, quieter, more like a cell, and opening a sketchbook. He begins a new drawing, not for a patron, not for fame, but as a kind of diary. In its lines he records the faces of the crowd, the nuns, the printer, the old apprentice. He draws them quickly, almost furtively, as if trying to catch them before they dissolve into legend. He knows the stories will continue without him, but on this page he writes their names, his own hand steady. He sets down his quill and listens to the city outside. Bells toll, voices rise, drums fade into distance. His work, he realizes, is no longer a series of commissions but a living current in the life of the city, sung, told, copied, misunderstood, adored. This is the strange afterlife of art, and he is both its author and its witness. Twilight in the studio, the master and his legacy. The rain has passed. A late afternoon sun filters through warped glass, striking the edge of a copper basin and scattering warm flecks of light across the studio floor. Dust motes hang suspended like tiny constellations. This is no longer the boisterous workshop of the young painter. It is quieter now, more like a sanctuary. The apprentices who once bustled here are masters of their own, the laughter of youth replaced by the hushed shuffle of a few dedicated assistants and the slow scratch of the master's quill across vellum. He moves through the room with deliberate calm, touching pigments he once ground himself, fingering sketches pinned to the walls. In one corner an unfinished altarpiece leans against the easel, underdrawing a pale ghost of what will become color and gold. In another, chests are stacked high with studies, horses, draperies, cherubs, a lifetime of ideas waiting to be reborn in someone else's hand. The studio has become a living archive, part memory palace, part classroom, part shrine. This chapter opens with that image of twilight in the studio and then follows a full day in this phase of life. In the morning, emissaries from a noble household arrive to discuss the disposition of earlier commissions. They bring with them stories of how his paintings have been moved, reframed, even. In the afternoon, a small group of young painters comes for instruction. They have read about him in the new printed Lives of Artists and approach with a mixture of reverence and curiosity. He shows them how to mix a deep ultramarine, but also how to stand back from a fresco to see its unity, less a technique than a way of seeing. As evening descends, a friend from the old days, a sculptor, visits. Over bread and wine they speak of changing times, of new patrons, new tastes, new worlds opening across the ocean. They laugh at their own reputations, recalling youthful mistakes and long-forgotten arguments. Through their conversation the reader feels the whole city outside, still vibrant and shifting even as their own pace slows. Finally, at night, the master remains alone. He lights a single candle and sits before a blank sheet. He sketches not for commission but for himself, a self-portrait, perhaps, or a scene from a dream. The candlelight throws his reflection against the wall, merging man and shadow. This intimate moment closes the chapter, hinting at the inward turn of an artist at the end of his public career. Throughout the prose the tone stays soft and immersive, the smell of pigment, the creak of wooden floors, the muffled bells of the city at dusk. It shows not only a studio but a life in transition, from production to preservation, from the outward gaze of commissions to the inward gaze of memory. It sets up naturally for a following chapter on final works, apprentices' futures, or the city's transformation, depending on where you want to take the saga next. Beyond the walls, pilgrimages, exchanges, and the artist's world. The bells of the city toll in the pale morning. The artist stands at the threshold of his studio, a heavy cloak over his shoulders. The square below is already alive with merchants shouting prices, apprentices running errands, friars moving between convents. For decades he has painted these figures on panels and plaster, giving them immortal color. Now he watches them as living parts of a tapestry he may soon leave behind. This chapter follows him outward, beyond the familiar smell of pigments and damp plaster. Journeys to see other masters. Invitations arrive from a ducal court to the north, from a cathedral chapter in France, from a wealthy merchant's palace in a port city. The artist travels by mule and river barge, seeing mountains and markets, ruins and rising fortresses. Each stop brings him new faces, new hands to shake, new ideas to sketch in his notebooks. Encounters with the wider world. In the ports he sees spices from the Levant, cloth from Flanders, instruments from Arabia. A ship's captain tells him of a new world across the ocean. Monks show him Greek manuscripts just arrived from Byzantium. All of it filters into his mind, a pattern for a border, a new shade of red, a story for a fresco. Pilgrimage and devotion. Along the way he stops at shrines and chapels, lighting candles not only for his soul but for the souls of those he has portrayed. He sketches reliquaries, statues, and the faces of pilgrims. The reader feels both the dust of the road and the hush of stone-vaulted naves. Return to the city with new eyes. When he finally comes home, the same square, the same bells, the same river seem changed. He carries the hum of distant languages, the smell of foreign incense, the memory of other skies. His apprentices gather around him as he unpacks sketches and stories. His studio becomes again a crossroads, students from other towns arrive, merchants bring pigments and papers never seen before, patrons commission altarpieces that hint at faraway lands. The prose can linger on the sensory details of travel, the sound of hooves on cobblestones, the flicker of torchlight in a wayside inn, the taste of wine pressed from another soil, and then contrast them with the quiet discipline of the studio. It shows how even a seemingly rooted master is part of a vast network of exchange and pilgrimage, and how the Renaissance itself was not just a style but a movement of people, objects, and ideas. A closing meditation. The city has gone quiet. The festival drums have faded, the bells are only a memory drifting through the night air. In a high window, the artist's studio stands dark, the pigments are sealed, the brushes rinsed and laid on cloth. A single candle trembles against the stone wall, throwing a small gold halo over unfinished sketches. Beneath that halo lie all the days you have just walked through, mornings of grinding color, afternoons of apprentices whispering and mixing plaster, evenings of patrons arriving with folded letters, nights of sketches spread like stars across a wooden table. They are no longer only his days, they are part of your memory now too, painted across your imagination. Breathe in slowly. Picture the courtyard emptying, the cloisters falling still, the scent of oil and dust settling. Picture the artist closing his eyes, the city folding itself into sleep around him. Every sound softens, the fountain trickles, the pigeons murmur, a door clicks shut far below. In this hush you can feel that time is a circle, not a line. Brushes wear down and are replaced, apprentices become masters, patrons die and their portraits outlast them, festivals return each year with the same colors. In the stillness after creation, there is no hurry, only the rhythm of breath, of seasons, of craft. Let that rhythm cradle you. Let the candlelight fade until the studio is only darkness, until the smell of pigment becomes the cool scent of night, until even